Welcome back. I hope everyone's keeping well. And given that we just came out of the lockdown and it looks like they're going to start talking about hate speech regulations again, I decided I'm going to dive into the issue of are the rights we have either natural or God given, or are they purely luxuries that the state affords us? Because I do believe there's an objective reality to this. And it's a pretty simple issue that at the same time has evolved legally and philosophically to become pretty complex. So hopefully I do the simple part justice because there's 100 ways to shape it and they all sound almost too simple to be a valid argument, despite the fact that they're true ultimately. Now, the God given argument gets regularly discredited because people argue that to state our rights are God given would at the same time require proof of God. So I'm not going to approach it like that. I'm going to come at it from a state of nature and just use logic and observable realities and ask simple questions that have simple answers but very definite implications towards the issue. And really, I'll only be echoing earlier men's thoughts because the conclusion here is not some epiphany, but more of a thing that the current establishment hopes we've all forgotten. Now, you can come at this issue from a lot of different angles. So to try avoid tangents, I'm going to try stick to the issue I want to clarify, which is that natural rights are inalienable. Or maybe the better way to put it is that they can only be surrendered willingly. They can never be taken. So aside from coming in different forms, like positive and negative rights, or entitlements and laws we're subject to, our idea of rights kind of comes from the fact that we're prohibited by law from doing certain things. So in reverse, we have the right to do everything else. So we might say the term rights implies everything we're allowed to do and everything the state is obliged to provide us with. Now, it can become a total rabbit hole to start really digging into the objectivity of different categories of rights. Because some of our rights to something aren't natural rights at all, and they exist only because the state does. These are things like healthcare or the assisted protection of your claim rights through a police force, and the deterrent of legal punishment. Now, arguably, these rights to things are part of the social contract and are inalienable as well to the extent that if the government withdraws them, then the contract is void because the conditions are no longer being met. But they still aren't natural rights. And one problem is that the social contract is a concept, like democracy. So neither are being executed from a universal or a specific template. And given that that's the case, I'm not going to focus on positive rights, which vary from country to country, but rather on the question of whether our remaining natural rights can be legitimately taken away. And the modern term rights makes no sense with regards to a state of nature, so a better way to understand it maybe is to think in terms of free will and autonomy. And arguably, children are under the natural authority of their parents until they're old enough to be capable. So when I say in a state of nature, all humans are completely autonomous, I mean the actions of adults really. Every adult has free will and we are under no authority until we submit ourselves to one. Now, to test if that's objectively true, all we need to do is ask why one adult would have a natural authority over another, or why one group hold organic authority over another group, because there's no way to rationalize that premise at all to come to a believable conclusion. There was no such thing in a state of nature. Any perceived authority was based on fear of violence or consent, like with some communities accepting the idea of elders or whatever. But they would have been the only natural deterrent on exercising your free will however you wanted. But so we've always had the right to free speech, in that there was no genuine natural authority to ever tell us otherwise, and there being no way to rationalise us not having free speech. And that speech has always had the potential to offend people. Now, back in the day, someone might get so angry about what I say that they attack me or kill me, because there were no laws to stop them from doing that either. But now the state has the responsibility from the social contract to protect the natural right of free speech in the interests of peaceful civilization. And one way being that it's illegal to physically harm people just for what they say. And I've always had the natural right to claim some land and live on it, because who had the authority to tell me I couldn't? There's no justification for why one person's word means more than another's. But equally, there was no authority to stop three lads deciding they liked the dwelling I built and the spot I picked. And again, they kill me or I kill them, because there are no rules. Or people turn up telling me I'm on the edge of what's already their land. But given that nothing in the state of nature confirms or protects ownership due to occupancy, then there's nothing really stopping me from killing them or them from killing me, and the winner takes the land, at least until the next conflict. So, aside from being a moral norm now, laws and the social contract essentially originate from the desire to limit conflict and loss of life, in the hopes of creating a more civil and productive environment. Without any civilization at all, we'd just do things, and there'd be no question of whether or not we had the right to do it. Authority implies the ability to punish, but the ability to punish alone doesn't qualify as authority. So they're related, but not to the extent that being better at violence was indicative of authority. So instead, we accepted a limiting of our free will in exchange for others also limiting theirs. Now, this highlights that the social contract is as much a contract with each other as it is a contract with the state. Although it's the state that will enforce the punishment for crime, the law is essentially an agreement among the population that you wouldn't like to be killed and so you shouldn't kill anyone either. It's a mutual contract based on ethics and preferential behaviour. It's not the whimsical use of authority. And that's arguably why they're trying to use ethics and preferential behaviour to change our normal behaviour now with the virus. It's a manipulative attempt at engineering consent, because if there was no virus and they tried giving us the 2 metre and 5 kilometre rules, we'd ask them who the fuck they think they are. But it's the typical approach of security over freedom, being accomplished through fear and the manipulation of pre-existing ethics. But back to the issue at hand. To suggest the government can take away our natural rights is to attribute a natural authority to the establishment that it just isn't capable of having from an objective standpoint. It was created long after the natural order began, so to imagine it can arrive halfway through and somehow innately hold power over individuals is comparable to a king believing the same thing. And I'd welcome anyone to try to rationalise why a king might naturally have authority over others, because it'll be a hard sell. And the government is man-made. It's not an organic instrument with an all-powerful mandate. Just like money, laws only hold any power at all because we all agree that they do. And because we loosely agree, institutions are created to uphold the system. The state does not issue and withdraw rights. It regulates interactions between individuals to ensure rights are being upheld. And we consent to its authority for the collective good of society and the benefits we receive from the contract. Without consent from the people, a government and a police force is nothing more than a modern day tribe trying to rule by force over others. At that point, the only thing that differentiates it from early authority by force is a uniform and some documents. Now, you might be thinking, I was never asked for consent. Now, the problem there being that it's not in the interests of a peaceful society to have a percentage of people who exit the contract. The contract only works if we're all in it, meaning anyone who has infringed on my rights can be held accountable by the system. So, in effect, to preserve the ability to protect the rights of others, the state effectively has to enforce the social contract on everyone. It's a kind of presumed consent that I think becomes legally binding through the birth certificate. But I'm not sure on that. That probably varies from country to country. So if the masses decide the state is no longer upholding the social contract, then the people have every natural right to resist the government's rule and replace them. The only problem being it has to be a big enough section of the population to pass in the court of public opinion as a justified rebellion. A few dozen individuals won't qualify as the population having withdrawn consent from the government, so arguably it won't undermine the state's authority. But we know by now that consent can be manufactured through manipulation too, so it's a complex issue. And that's why it's been argued that consent shouldn't really be the final say for a mandate to govern, but rather that the lack of rebellion from the population should be used as a measurement of consent. But then the problem is, what's the criteria for rebellion? And can it ever be met if a government is already overstepping and they're locking up protesters? And this is arguably why we need a system like I talked about in the video on democracy, where the population themselves can call a motion of no confidence in a government and remove them, to bypass the need for genuine revolt, which every government will instinctively try to suppress. But so the social contract is why activism generally works in Western civilization if it gathers enough momentum. Because any half-decent individuals running a country will understand that they're representatives, they're not rulers. Their job is to implement the will of the people. So if the people display a large percentage who want a reform, then a lot of times action will be taken on that issue, which is a demonstration of self-determination. Which again backs up the reality that the government don't rule us, they govern on our behalf. And a quick tangent here, this is why we've seen the astroturfing of the NGOs in Ireland trying to parade as that public desire for change. They create the appearance of a public desire like they're doing with racism or direct provision or the hate speech argument, and often they'll agitate enough that a section of the population will believe their sophistry and add validity to the supposed public desire. They manipulate the goodwill of people through deliberate misrepresentation of situations, or outright lies that they have no response to when they're questioned about. And this is why the NGOs and the modern script reading journalists are so important to the people trying to rule us. Because the establishment know that they can't just take our rights. They have to manufacture that consent. They can talk about trying to make it illegal to do things I previously had the right to do, but that's just sophistry and a meek acceptance of a false narrative. None of our natural rights in the beginning were bestowed upon us legally, and so you can write what you want on paper, but it doesn't mean we have to submit to it. They can't arbitrarily adjust our free will to their personal preference, but we can submit to regulating our behaviour, usually in exchange for protections and benefits. And a good recent example of that would be the smoking ban, in that although plenty of people probably didn't like it, there was enough logic behind it to gain approval and for the population to agree to regulate its free will in that regard. But never in any other form of contract could one member of the agreement change the details without the consent of the other party and expect it to remain valid. And I don't have a good knowledge of the law, so I'm not saying it's legally impossible for them to do that. I'm saying it'd be wrong by our current understanding of a contract, and it's beyond their mandate when they were elected to manage and govern, not to rule and rewrite the contract. It's kind of like saying they can change the laws tomorrow and lock us up for no reason. I mean, they may be technically confined a loophole, but we know enough in our hearts to know it's not their right to do that. And it's not going to fly for long before the population has had enough and goes mental. We don't live under dictators, no matter what they like to think. And without the consent of the people, a law is just something written on paper. Essentially, the modern term of rights translates into our remaining permissible free will after contractually limiting our behaviour along with benefits from the state. But to believe a government can limit or take our free will as they see fit is becoming comparable to slavery. And no matter how legal you make the slavery, laws don't transcend nature unless we agree to them. And even having the force to implement slavery doesn't give it authority, just the ability to maintain and punish. And people will always have the natural right to rebel and reinforce their autonomy. Now, if this whole question shows us anything, it's that maybe a lot of this needs to be re-examined legally. Because if the government can appear to exercise authority over our natural rights in a legal way, then they have too much power, and that's an area of the law that needs work. This is another reason why any form of communism or fascism runs contrary to natural rights too, because no man or woman can give an objective justification as to why they hold authority over me, and no person or party who refuses to engage in an election can be deemed to have the consent of the people. In the political sense, it requires regular confirmation to truly represent continued consent, because consent is not perpetual, and it can be withdrawn if the performance delivered is not satisfactory. And that's what she said. Stop, behave. But so there's some really interesting stuff written on the social contract. It's really worth a look. Like most political philosophy, it's a developing issue, so it's almost impossible to give final conclusions on. But it's interesting stuff, because when we forget things like this, we start to believe the government is all powerful, but it's far from it. To believe we're just the well-treated subjects of the state is to misunderstand natural rights and to fail to consider a natural state of existence or the idea of the social contract. We're not subjects. We're autonomous individuals engaged in a contract with each other that has benefits to the individual and the community as a whole, and that require institutions to uphold the laws. The only thing that can give the state the ability to take our rights away is if we do nothing and consent when they try, which is why engineered consent is so dangerous, and arguably why a pandemic could be seen as a perfect weapon for anyone looking to manipulate power. And the abortion referendum proves that consent allows the contract to be adjusted, and the prospect of hate speech laws will make the issue prominent again, and we have to make sure to not give them the consent they'll be looking for. Because if they can make it look like the population agrees, then they can pretend they have the mandate, and it becomes just another part of the contract and another right that people supposedly gave up willingly. The entire plan now is based around sophistry and the amount of manipulation required to manufacture consent to either limit our natural rights or to expand the list of entitlements for our new Irish. But they need our consent, or they wouldn't bother with the charade. They'd just bring in employment quotas. But I'll stop branching off into related subjects. I really just wanted to point out what becomes pretty obvious when taken from a natural starting point, which is that no person or group holds any authority over any other person or group from a natural standpoint, and any limiting of free will or autonomy will always be the product of fear or the conscious agreement to adhere to preferential behaviour. There is no natural authority on earth, and I for one won't be bullied, and I'm not interested in giving up any more freedom for any amount of security. So I'll wrap it up there anyway. Slán go fóill agus tógtha bug é.